Welcome to the third week of the course. This week we are going to examine the long colonial period from 1492 to 1810. 1810, by the way, is when the Spanish-American Wars of Independence began, so we'll use that as a marker between the colonial and independent periods. And remember, the main focus of our course is the 19th and the 20th centuries in Latin American history, so this is still a background lecture that will help set us up for the main focus of the course. And this week is important because one of the big themes in the region's history is its colonial legacy. And this legacy includes deep social inequalities, political violence, land concentration, economic subordination to foreign powers, among others. These are all issues that every Latin American nation has had to deal with since gaining independence. And over the next several minutes, I'll go over the general characteristics of the colonial period. So what was the logic behind empire? In other words, why did Spain and Portugal colonize the Americas? What was motivating them? And an easy way to remember their motivations is that it was about the three G's: gold, God, and glory. These are things that are always taught in this course, and I remember learning these three G's about 20 years ago when I took this same course. Spain and Portugal, they were out to get rich, and they were out to accumulate wealth, and specifically precious metals, gold and silver. Because in these centuries, that was how wealth was measured, was through the accumulation of precious metals. And I'll talk more about gold and silver in the third lecture video of this week, which covers the colonial economy. And the second reason for empire was God. Spain and Portugal, they were ruled by a divine monarch, a king, and he had the authority from the Pope to spread Christianity, and specifically Catholicism, in the Western Hemisphere. It's crucial to understand that the European conquest of Latin America was a joint enterprise between the Spanish and Portuguese states on the one hand and the Catholic Church on the other. Like the king and the church, they're in this together. Catholicism was the official religion of these colonial governments, and no other religion was tolerated. Thousands of missionaries fanned out across the hemisphere to convert native peoples to Christianity. Thousands of churches were built, and religion dominated daily life all over the colonies. The Catholic Church, meanwhile, accumulated enormous wealth, including extensive lands, urban properties, and hard cash that it often loaned out. It acted like a banker, in other words. And when we get to the 19th century, one of the main struggles we'll see in Latin America after independence was this effort to separate church and state in order to establish secular republics. Third on the slide here is glory. The conquistadors and the monarchies of Europe, they were out for glory. And this was a time period, of course, when these countries, Britain, France, Spain, and Portugal, were in competition with each other. And they were also at war with each other, as we'll see throughout these centuries. So they were out for glory, for imperial glory, and expanding empire. In this map that you see here briefly, I just put it here because it's a European exploration of the Americas. So it shows many of the routes that Europeans took. And the ones we're most focused on, of course, would be the Spanish, which are the routes in purple. You can see they explored much of the Americas, but also the Portuguese routes, which are in green. The core of the Spanish Empire was in Mexico and Peru, where millions of indigenous peoples had already lived in wealthy civilizations. So you can see here on the map, the Spanish Empire was one of the largest in the world at the time. And in the Americas, we can see that it stretched all across the western half of South America, throughout the Andean Mountains, throughout the Caribbean, Central America, Mexico, and even up into North America, such as present-day California and Texas. As I mentioned, Mexico and Peru, they are the core of the Spanish Empire. And they found not only an abundance of labor to exploit and work on their plantations in those regions, but it was also in Mexico and Peru where silver deposits were discovered. And I'll discuss the mining economy in the third lecture video of this week. And throughout the 3 centuries of colonialism, Mexico and Peru, they were the most valuable colonies of Spain. And Spain created a very centralized empire to watch over its wealth in the Americas. Spain drafted some 400,000 laws to govern the colonies. And colonial officials, they had a good deal of power in Spanish America. And keep in mind that it took between 2 and 3 months to sail by ship over the ocean, across the ocean, So there was a lag in communication between what was going on with the Spanish monarchy and colonial officials in the Americas. So this gave them quite a good bit of autonomy to govern the Americas. Also keep in mind that Spanish America was separated by enormous distances and impassable mountains, such as the Andes. And this tended to result in strong regional and local identities that developed over the colonial period. And while over 1 million Europeans would migrate to the Americas during the colonial period, keep in mind that Europeans in the Americas, especially in Mexico and Peru, were almost always outnumbered by native peoples, even despite their drastic decline in numbers, as we'll discuss. Also have a quick look on this map of the Portuguese Empire, and specifically the Portuguese Empire on the coast of South America, the Atlantic coast of South America. You can see that Portugal basically just colonized the coastline of the Americas. And let's have a look at another map. This map gives us a closer look at the Portuguese Empire in the Americas. And you can see Portugal just colonized the coastline of South America. The interior remained dominated by indigenous groups for most of the colonial period. It wasn't until gold was discovered in the interior in the 1690s that Portugal started to penetrate the continent. And I'll discuss the gold rush here in a few lecture videos. Also notice on the map the Dutch colony from 1630 to 1654. The Dutch were able to wrestle control of northeastern Brazil away from Portugal, and there was a long war, but by the mid-1650s, Portugal had overcome the Dutch and expelled them from South America. And the Portuguese Empire was a little bit different from the Spanish Empire. And the main difference was that the Portuguese government did not construct as centralized of an empire as did Spain. Portugal had a more hands-off approach to colonization. And instead, in Portuguese America, large landowners dominated colonial life. Portuguese America was essentially a string of Atlantic coastal cities that were more connected to the mother country than they were with each other. And the primary obstacle to colonization of the interior of Brazil was the distance itself. You can notice that Brazil, unlike the United States, does not possess an ocean on the other side. And so therefore colonization of the interior of Brazil was much slower than that of the United States. And by the end of the 18th century, only about 3 million people lived in all of Brazil. So Brazil in the 16th century and the early colonial period was of secondary importance, but I'll talk more about the sugar economy that took root there in the 16th century. Let's now move on to the next lecture video, which covers the Columbian Exchange.